This pickled radish is made especially for you, my dear. Please enjoy it all by yourself," said my mother-in-law as she handed me a large amount of pickled radish before returning to her hometown. As soon as I opened the package, a foul odor filled the room, making me pinch my nose involuntarily. The color wasn't the bright red I was expecting, it was discolored. Clearly, this wasn't the pickled radish I was familiar with, so I asked my husband to check it. My husband insisted that this was how pickled radish was supposed to be, and started giving me a lecture on how pickles are naturally pungent. Since he was so adamant, I decided to have him taste it. I chopped the pickled radish finely and added it to a dish for dinner. My husband didn't realize it was pickled radish and thought it was one of the other pickles my mother-in-law had brought. As my mother-in-law bragged about her pickles, I struggled to hold back my laughter since my husband was eating something else entirely. "Mom's pickles are the best," he declared, nearly finishing the whole dish. As a result, he ended up with severe dehydration in the middle of the night and learned a harsh truth. Both my husband and I had moved away from our hometowns for work. Although we worked for different companies, we met through mutual friends and eventually developed a romantic relationship, leading to our marriage. I had expressed my desire to continue working even after marriage, and my husband understood, so we started our married life in a new home conveniently located for both our commutes. My parents are still alive, but my husband's father had passed away, leaving his mother to live alone in their family home. I didn't know this at the time, but when our marriage was decided, my mother-in-law had suggested that we live with her. Her home was in a rural area, the kind where buses to the nearest station only run a few times a day, and the neighbors, having lived there for generations, are not very welcoming to newcomers. My husband loves his mother, but even he found rural life challenging and had firmly stated before our marriage that living with his mother was out of the question. He had continued to refuse her requests, citing my job as the reason, which resulted in my mother-in-law having a very poor opinion of me. My late father-in-law had bought several old houses to rent out, thinking of my mother-in-law who would be left alone. He bought them around the time old-style cafes and bakeries were becoming popular, and they were doing well. Despite the rural setting, information is readily available online these days. Good reviews attract customers from other regions, and they even handle mail orders, so business was thriving. My husband told me that my mother-in-law was living comfortably on the rental income and her husband's inheritance. My mother-in-law had once been featured on TV as a pickling expert. Because of this, she had a steady customer base and also sold her pickles at local farmers' markets. My husband had loved her pickles since childhood, and regularly received them even after moving away. However, he wanted freshly made pickles and for me to learn his mother's pickling techniques, so he persistently asked me to learn from her. Incidentally, I'm not a fan of pickles or food made by others, such as homemade rice balls. Other than his obsession with his mother's pickles, my husband is a normal, kind, and cooperative ideal partner. To avoid straining our relationship, I've been subtly putting off his requests. My mother-in-law's dislike for me stems not only from my job being the reason my husband refused to live with her, but also from her old-fashioned beliefs. She thinks a woman's role is to stay home and have a male heir after marriage. She has called me arrogant for working full-time even after marriage and foolish for trying to compete with men. She even suggested that I might be a spendthrift unable to live on my husband's income alone. When visiting her, she always pushed housework onto me because, in her view, it's a daughter-in-law's duty. I don't mind being asked to help, but cooking in an unfamiliar kitchen and using an old washing machine is challenging since I'm not used to them. At first, my mother-in-law showed me how to use them, but she quickly grew irritated with my questions. Eventually, she snapped and called me a useless daughter-in-law who can't even do housework. I subtly confided in my husband, but he told me to put up with it since it wasn't a daily occurrence. He said it was proof that, as women, we didn't need to be overly considerate of each other. When I started talking about my mother-in-law, he would leave the house, saying he was going to visit an old friend. Sometimes, he wouldn't come back all night. This made my mother-in-law even more irritable since she had hoped to spend time with him. It became a vicious cycle, and I began to dread visiting my in-laws. It would have been easier if it were just stress. The stress and tension would often give me migraines and heartburn, conditions I rarely experienced otherwise. Even when I told my husband I wanted to avoid going because it made me physically ill, he insisted I should comply out of filial duty. "Don't talk like a kid refusing to go to school. It's all in your head," he would say, dismissing my concerns as childish whims. Reluctantly, I would accompany him. The reason for my physical distress when visiting my in-laws wasn't just my mother-in-law's snide remarks. She had spread rumors in the neighborhood, calling me a wicked daughter-in-law. Already viewed with suspicion as a city girl and an outsider, I was now seen as someone who mistreated my mother-in-law. It was common for neighbors to ignore my greetings, whisper about me behind my back, or give me cold stares. Whether inside the house or outside, I never felt at ease. It was suffocating. Even when we returned home, I couldn't relax because my mother-in-law would sometimes visit during long weekends. She would call just before arriving, saying, "I'm at the nearest station," leaving me no choice but to pick her up. I asked her to come when my husband was home, but she never listened. I begged my husband to tell her not to come when he wasn't around, but he insisted it was her right as family to visit whenever she wanted. I knew my mother-in-law's sudden visits were meant to harass me. She would inspect the house like a surprise test, criticizing my cleaning and calling me lazy for using frozen food. My husband didn't mind simple meals made with frozen ingredients, understanding that we both worked full-time. He would say it was only fair, given our circumstances. Despite these issues, my husband was a great partner, helping with housework and understanding when I had to work extra hours or on short notice. His support allowed me to focus on my career. So, I convinced myself that enduring my mother-in-law was a small price to pay. Several months later, we planned another visit to my in-laws. For some reason, my mother-in-law was in a good mood that day and told me to rest while she prepared dinner. Though it felt odd, I took her up on her offer. Despite her cooking, I found the food overly seasoned, thinking she might have done it to match my husband's taste for alcohol during his visits. However, a few hours later, I began feeling unwell. The discomfort turned into diarrhea and stomach cramps. It became clear that I was the only one affected, as neither my mother-in-law nor my husband showed any symptoms. The overly strong seasoning was likely to mask spoiled ingredients intentionally added to my portion. The next day, my condition hadn't improved, but my husband left, saying he had plans. It seemed his plans involved meeting another woman. I realized it was a woman because he was unusually concerned about his appearance. Right after we got married, he didn't care much about his looks during our visits back home. That was probably because he was genuinely meeting old friends. But lately, it had been different. Despite feeling something was off, I couldn't think clearly due to the lingering discomfort in my stomach and assumed it was just an old female friend. Not long after returning from the trip to my in-laws, I discovered my husband was cheating. This visit to his parents was forced into a busy period for both of us. We were both working overtime at least half the week. My husband often left for work earlier in the morning, and we hardly saw each other. We had planned the visit for a time when things were supposed to calm down, but it turned out my husband had lied about his schedule being free. After returning from his parents' house, our busy schedules resumed, and we kept missing each other. My workload had lightened, allowing me to leave work on time, but I had to handle all the housework alone. It took me several days to unpack the bags we took on our trip. While unpacking my husband's things, I found something unusually cute for him. At first, I thought it was a souvenir for a female colleague, but the attached message made it clear it was meant for my husband. The content was like a conversation between lovers, confirming my suspicion of his affair. All his recent visits back home, prioritizing meetups with old friends over spending time with his parents, and his overnight stays after drinking were all excuses to cover up his affair. The unease I felt while suffering from stomach pain was justified. He had left me behind to meet his mistress, not an old female friend. I recognized the name of the woman involved. It was the same last name as the neighbor my mother-in-law introduced to me right after our wedding. The unusual surname stuck with me. It was hard to believe my husband was having an affair with his mother's childhood friend. So I figured it was probably her daughter. I was in shock, not just from the betrayal but also from the fact that my husband had forced the visits to his parents' house, knowing how uncomfortable they made me, just to carry on his affair. Anger mixed with the shock as I realized he had abandoned me in my time of need for his selfish desires. Divorce was the first thing that came to mind. I couldn't continue living with him. However, I couldn't help but wonder if I was at fault. Had I relied too much on his understanding nature? Should I have taken on more housework as his wife? Maybe he desired a more domesticated partner. These thoughts made me question if his infidelity was a result of my shortcomings. I resolved to cut back on overtime and refuse weekend work. I would strive to be a supportive wife. Maybe if I changed my attitude, my husband would return to being the kind and considerate person he was when we first got married. At that time, the thought of divorce didn't cross my mind. I truly believed that my husband would come back to me if I showed more support. After a while, my husband's work settled down, and we had more time together. I had accumulated some vacation days, so I combined them with a long weekend to take a week off. I had a feeling my mother-in-law would visit during that break. As I predicted, she came over. She brought a large amount of her special pickles, which had apparently turned out well. My husband was thrilled and in high spirits because of it. I seized this opportunity, determined to be the supportive wife. However, dealing with my demanding mother-in-law left me utterly exhausted, both physically and mentally. When she found out I had taken a week off, she extended her stay without asking. Normally, she'd stay for 1 or 2 nights, but this time she stayed for 5 nights and 6 days. When she finally left, she told me to make sure I ate the pickled radish myself before leaving. I found it odd that she didn't want me to serve the pickled radish while she was there. Especially since my husband loves her pickles and would have wanted to eat it. Why did she want to feed the pickled radish to me and not my husband? Suspicious, I checked the pickled radish as soon as she left. A terrible odor hit me when I opened the container. It was discolored and looked nothing like the usual bright yellow pickled radish. Anyone familiar with pickled radish would see at a glance that it had gone bad. The other pickles she brought during her stay were still fine, even after a few days. Reflecting on it, I remembered how insistent she was about not touching the container with the pickled radish, almost snapping at me to leave it alone. Given her and my husband's obsession with pickles, I didn't think much of it at the time. When my husband returned after seeing her off, I showed him the pickled radish and asked, "This is spoiled, right? Pickles are like this. There are pickled radishes of this color." He started explaining pickles to me in a condescending tone, suggesting I wouldn't understand since I wasn't familiar with them. Realizing it was useless to argue, I devised a plan to get him to eat it. I knew he would avoid it if it still smelled and looked bad, so I disguised it. To mask the odor, I mixed the finely chopped pickled radish with strong-smelling cheese, seasonings, and spices. I then mixed it with ground beef. I also made a sauce by mixing the chopped pickled radish with tomatoes, using it generously on tacos. I added extra vinegar to make it more sour and hide the spoiled taste. My husband immediately recognized the dishes as made with his mother's pickles. He complained, saying I ruined the pickles and wasted his precious mother's pickles. But despite his grumbling, he praised how versatile they were and finished everything. That night, he started suffering from severe stomach pain and hogged the bathroom. He couldn't stop vomiting and had a slight fever, so he begged me to call an ambulance. He vomited several times in the shaking ambulance, losing his dignity. His clothes were soiled, and once he was treated, his entire outfit was returned to me in a plastic bag. I couldn't bring myself to wash them, so I threw them out on trash day. The doctor who treated him said it was food poisoning. If it had been from eating out or takeout, they would need to contact the restaurant to check if anyone else had similar symptoms. In cases of food poisoning, the vomit is often saved for testing, and my husband's vomit was used to determine the cause. It turned out the culprit was the pickled radish, and they asked where we got it from. When I explained that it was homemade by my mother-in-law, the doctor advised us to be cautious with homemade food as it doesn't last long. My husband heard the entire conversation. Once we were alone, he started complaining. Why did I deliberately make him eat spoiled pickled radish? Why didn't I get food poisoning if we ate the same thing? I explained that I didn't eat it because I knew it was spoiled, but when I showed it to him, he insisted it was just how pickles were supposed to look, so I served it to him. My husband didn't think it was spoiled, having absolute faith in his mother's pickling skills. But the fact was, he got food poisoning from the spoiled pickled radish. Angry, he called his mother and put the phone on speaker, demanding I speak to her. Tell her about your symptoms and how much you suffered, he insisted. I began. Thank you for the pickles you brought the other day. Unfortunately, my husband got food poisoning from them. Even over the phone, I could tell she was shaken. I hadn't specified which pickles, but she immediately knew which ones caused the issue. Why did you feed him that pickled radish? I told you to eat it yourself, she exclaimed. This made my husband even angrier. You knew it was spoiled and still gave it to us? You know my wife doesn't eat pickles much. I'm the one who usually eats your pickles, not her. But if you put it on the table, she'd eat a slice or two, right? During her recent stay, did my wife eat any pickles? As far as I remember, she didn't touch them. The chances of her eating pickles you leave out are slim to none. It seemed my husband was more observant of my habits than I thought. I felt a bit happy, but it also made me realize that while my husband got furious when he was hurt, he would just brush off my questions with some trivial explanations. He only gets angry if he's affected personally. I realized he doesn't care about me the same way he cares about himself. My mother-in-law started rambling about how pickles are essential for health. My husband pressed her hard, refusing to let her get away with her excuses. Eventually, she admitted that she gave me the spoiled pickled radish to punish me because she didn't like me. My husband was furious that she involved him in her scheme and couldn't calm down. Watching him, I felt disillusioned. He was quick to turn against his mother, whom he had trusted so much, as soon as he became the victim. He threatened to expose what she had done to the people who regularly bought her pickles if she ever did something like this again. While it seemed like he would suffer the most if she stopped making pickles, he was too angry to think ahead. I decided to divorce him. The idea that all this time I thought I just needed to endure it seemed ridiculous now. My husband had to stay in the hospital for a while, so I went home, leaving him there. Modern hospitals provide almost everything, so he could manage with just a few essentials. I decided to let him use the hospital's rental pajamas and gave him $100 for anything else he might need from the gift shop. When I got home and turned on my phone, there were several voicemail messages from my mother-in-law, all blaming me. The first few messages were enough to get the gist, so I deleted the rest without listening. I didn't call her back. I packed my things and left the house, leaving a note on the living room table explaining that I was filing for divorce. A few days later, my husband called me after being discharged, furious about the note. He acted as if he was completely innocent. I ignored his complaints and told him I wasn't going to retract the letter. I also mentioned I was considering asking for alimony and that all future communication should be through my lawyer. His angry voice faded into background noise as I hung up. I told my lawyer that I wanted to claim alimony from my husband and sue his mistress for the emotional distress damages. Apparently, they received the notice from my lawyer shortly after. Ignoring my request to communicate through lawyers, my mother-in-law came to my place to complain. As a wife, what do you think you're doing? A man having an affair is just his nature. You should overlook it. My mother-in-law started saying it's better for a man to be popular with women than not, completely missing the point. Then, because she couldn't find out where I was living, she waited for me outside my workplace. Soon, my husband and his mistress were also waiting outside my office. claiming the alimony was unfair. My husband blamed me, saying it was my fault for not noticing sooner, and that if I had, the affair wouldn't have gotten serious. His mistress also claimed that if I had been a better wife and satisfied him, he wouldn't have strayed. They both argued that the alimony should be reduced. Their daily ambushes outside my office started becoming a topic of gossip at work. Some people who overheard their rants defended me, saying I wasn't at fault. While my reputation at work remained intact, it was clear they were causing trouble for everyone around. I began to wonder if reducing the alimony would stop their harassment. However, my lawyer, who was very supportive, helped me through this ordeal. My company even started considering taking legal action against them for harassment. When my husband realized that the situation was escalating beyond just our divorce, he finally agreed to our terms. We divorced successfully, and I received the full alimony from him. The mistress, for some reason, was very obedient to my mother-in-law, embodying her ideal daughter-in-law. My mother-in-law, preferring her over me, decided it was better to pay me off quickly and get my husband remarried. Even though my husband agreed to the divorce, he resisted paying the alimony until the end. My mother-in-law ended up covering in a lump sum. A while later, my husband reappeared. Having learned from the company's lawsuit experience, he waited for me near the train station instead of my office. I tried to ignore him and walk past, but he grabbed my arm. When I glanced at the nearby police box, he pleaded tearfully for me to hear him out. To avoid causing a scene, I agreed to listen to him briefly. Instead of a conversation, it was a plea for help. Apparently, his mistress had been complaining about being sued for the emotional distress damages, which led to my mother-in-laws and their misdeeds being exposed. News of their behavior quickly spread, and they were ostracized by the community, who began a campaign to drive them out. Unable to shop locally, my mother-in-law's reputation as a pickling expert was ruined, and articles exposing her true nature appeared in local newspapers. Her customers learned about her actions, leading to a wave of product returns. My mother-in-law, having spent her savings on the alimony, couldn't handle the refunds. Ignoring the customers' demands for refunds led them to storm my mother-in-law's house, causing such a commotion that she couldn't live there anymore and had to move in with my husband. The mistress, abandoned by her parents with nowhere to go, also stayed at my mother-in-law's house for a while. However, scared to be alone, she eventually moved in with my husband and mother-in-law. My mother-in-law even took the mistress to my husband's workplace to introduce her. At that time, my husband was out for a meeting with a client. Taking advantage of his absence, my mother-in-law badmouthed me, her former daughter-in-law. My mother-in-law introduced the mistress as my husband's new wife, bragging about her character and calling her the perfect daughter-in-law. It seemed my husband hadn't informed his company about our divorce. Naturally, his co-workers and boss were shocked. As they listened to the story, they realized that the timelines of our marriage and his affair overlapped. When they pointed this out, my mother-in-law and the mistress justified the affair by saying it was my fault for being a lousy wife. They left, saying that an unfaithful wife deserved to be cheated on. When my husband returned from his business trip, his boss called him in to discuss the situation. By then, he was already the subject of gossip among his colleagues, who viewed him as a terrible man who neglected his wife in favor of an affair. The rumors spread to other departments, and even employees who barely knew him started to look down on him. He approached me, asking, "Can you tell everyone that the divorce was your idea and that I did nothing wrong? Why would I do that? If you say it, I can escape this situation. It was your fault for not getting along with my mother. You blamed me for not living with your mother, even though we both agreed to work. You supported that decision, remember? If I had opposed it, you wouldn't have married me. I didn't want to be embarrassed by a failed proposal." He admitted, which made me despise him even more. "This mess is because I accommodated your demands. So, it's your fault, right? Now go explain to my colleagues and boss. What's in it for me? Considering everything I endured during our marriage, you should be doing more for me," he replied arrogantly. I fought the urge to punch him and shook off his hand, walking away. It seemed like I was their last resort. He didn't stop there and started calling my office, which disrupted my work. While I was working, my husband took advantage of my politeness to make excuses. When I responded indifferently, he got angry and started shouting. But I no longer wanted anything to do with him, so I instructed my colleagues to only put through calls related to business and not to transfer any calls that seemed to be from him. When he continued calling, I warned him I'd sue for harassment, which finally made him stop. Eventually, his reputation at work was so damaged by the rumors that he resigned. He believed he'd be fine living off his mother's assets. But it turned out she was deeply in debt. Articles revealing her true nature as a bully disguised as a pickling expert circulated among her customers, leading to a flood of product returns. Although they started refunding the customers, the financial strain became severe. It wasn't that they were out of money, but my mother-in-law didn't want to dip too much into the inheritance left by my late father-in-law since she wanted it to last. The news of my mother-in-law's actions spread widely, and she fell for a scam promising financial assistance. She was convinced that investing the inheritance would not only cover the losses from the pickles but also turn a profit, so she invested everything. The houses my father-in-law had left her were also losing tenants who didn't want to be associated with her. Desperate for income, she clung to the scammer's promises. The scammer convinced her to borrow more money from shady lenders, leading to debts far exceeding the inheritance. The mistress, realizing that working to pay off the debt was futile, stopped following my mother-in-law's commands. She was a strong-willed woman and began to openly defy my mother-in-law. However, my mother-in-law's bullying was relentless, leaving my husband caught in the middle. Instead of siding with the mistress, my husband wavered, sometimes supporting his mother and other times asking the mistress to bear with it. This indecisiveness led the mistress to lose interest and leave, unable to return to her hometown or rely on her parents. Her whereabouts became unknown, though there were rumors of someone resembling her living on the streets. But I don't know if they're true. Unfazed, my husband and mother-in-law showed up at my door again. I had already deleted my husband's number and blocked any calls from him or his family. They didn't know where I lived, and my workplace had repeatedly warned them about harassment, preventing them from ambushing me there. In a desperate move, they went to my parents' house, demanding they contact me. Knowing what had happened, my parents called the police, reporting it as stalking. My husband and mother-in-law tried to name me as their guarantor, but I firmly refused. My mother-in-law managed to get out by relying on distant relatives, but they cut ties with her immediately after, telling her never to contact them again. With nowhere left to turn, my husband and mother-in-law ended up living in poverty. Meanwhile, I continued working at the same company, where I could now focus on my job without their interference. My work environment improved, and I found time to enjoy my hobbies, leading a fulfilling life both personally and professionally.